Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Wild Vaughn Manor. And it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And today, for June on the Range, this is a special June on the Range episode of Epic Comic Book Wednesday. June on the Range, all June long, it's been a celebration of Westerns and reading Westerns here on BookTube. Isn't that exciting? Roger's sitting over there, he's like, yeah, whatever, man. So, today, it's a special Western version of Epic Comic Book Wednesday because we're going to talk about the Rawhide Kid. Yes, this is the Rawhide Kid. This is going to be great, Roger. We're talking about a comic book character that most people have never even heard of. Man, this is going to be my most popular video yet. Anyway, it's the Rawhide Kid. So, the Rawhide Kid was one of Marvel Comics' Western characters. You see, back in the olden days, as I've mentioned before, when I've talked about June on the Range, Westerns used to rule the roost. Back in the old days, Westerns were really, really, really popular. And if you went to a bookstore in the 50s or 60s and into the 70s even, well, there would be a ton of Westerns there because it was such a popular genre. I mean, millions of Westerns were printed. And Westerns were all over television in the 50s and 60s. There were Western movies produced every 5 minutes. And so all of the major comic book companies, and probably some of the minor comic book companies as well, had Western comic books. And one of Marvel's was Rawhide Kid. Marvel also had Two Gun Kid. It had Two Gun Rawhide Kid. Actually, no, I just made that up. But they had a few different Western characters. But Rawhide Kid was the most popular Western character of all for Marvel Comics. And the Rawhide Kid was actually the Rawhide Kid first came out in the 1950s for its first 16 issues. But then, and that was for Atlas Comics. Marvel Comics was Atlas Comics before it was Marvel Comics, back in the 50s. So, back in the 50s, the Rawhide Kid's first 16 issues came out. And I've never seen those. I don't know if those issues have ever been reprinted, ever. Does anybody know? Because I know this is the essential collection of Rawhide Kid. There are not many collections of these comics. As far as I know, there's only this one and the Marvel Masterworks. Marvel Masterworks at least has 2 volumes of the Rawhide Kid. I don't know if they have 3, but I know they at least have 2. And neither this nor the Marvel Masterworks collections have those first 16 issues from the 50s. And I don't know, since I've never seen them, if there's any continuity at all between the character that was the Rawhide Kid in the 50s and the character that was the Rawhide Kid in the 60s. Because this character was revamped, rebooted, back before rebooting was a thing, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So it's reinvented, this character was. And there is some continuity because this collection starts off with issue number 17. And unfortunately, I only have this essential collection to show you, so it's all in black and white. This is from Marvel's Essential line, which is the line of reprints, the really cheap reprints they had before they came up with the Marvel Epic collections, which are much better. But the Essential lines, they were like their cheapy line. They had the Marvel Masterworks that was expensive, and they had cheap. Really cheap, actually. And these essentials were all in black and white. And I actually don't mind that so much. I don't mind the black and white comics because my color vision is kind of non-existent anyway. But this is a really cool comic. And so I started reading this in the beginning of the month for June on the Range. Then I set it down and started only reading Batman and Superman and some EC comics. And I realized a couple days ago, oh my goodness, I'm doing an Epic Comic Book Wednesday. I need to read the rest of Rawhide Kid. And there's like 500 pages of Rawhide Kid in this essential volume. So I buckled down the last couple days. And this will actually be the last thing that I read actually for June on the Range, unfortunately. Because this month, as far as reading time, has not been great. That is off subject. Anyway, off topic, my friend. A digression. Here we go. Rawhide Kid. I finally did read this whole thing. And like I said, this was rebooted by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And I don't know, like I said, what the Rawhide Kid was like before, but this version of Rawhide Kid was a kid. He was, 18 years old, 19 years old, something like that. And he was abandoned when he was a kid, when he was a child. And he was raised by his Uncle Ben. That's his Uncle Ben. And you're saying, wait a minute. A Marvel Comics comic book where this guy is raised by Uncle Ben? That doesn't sound like it's going to be too good for Uncle Ben. We know what happens to Uncle Ben's in Marvel Comics, and you would be correct. Uncle Ben is killed. Right here. He's killed in a sneaky fashion by these sneaky evil owl hoots. They're owl hoots. There's a lot of owl hoots in this. And so the Rawhide Kid is born. And so the Rawhide Kid is an interesting character. He goes after the evil owl hoots and takes care of them. But he has some limitations because this comic book is a comic book that pretty much has to stick to the Comics Code Authority. The dreadful Comics Code Authority, which was put in place by comic book companies as a self-censorship measure after the trouble EC Comics got into in the 50s. When comic books were blamed for like everything. Comic books were blamed for everything the same way violent movies were blamed for everything for a while, and role-playing games were blamed for everything for a while, and then video games, of course. Parents have to blame something for their terrible children, and so comic books were blamed. And the dreadful Comics Code Authority was put in place, which means the hero can't just go around shooting folks and killing them. And so we have a character like the Rawhide Kid who can't kill people. In fact, there's not a lot of killing in the Rawhide Kid comic book. There's some, but not a lot. And the Rawhide Kid, he just, he shoots people in the arm, or he shoots the guns out of their hands. Because the one thing about the Rawhide Kid, is he practically has superpowers. I don't know if it was ever official that he was a mutant, but it seemed like he could have been an X-Men. It seemed like he could have had superpowers because he is so lightning fast that nobody can see him move even when he draws his guns. People can't even see him do it. He's so quick. And the Rawhide Kid is the gimmick of the Rawhide Kid. There's a gimmick here used in these comics. And that is the Rawhide Kid is a little guy. Originally, he is described as being 5'3" and 125 pounds, I think. Now, that was retconned almost immediately, and suddenly he was 160 pounds. I guess he had a lot of pancakes someplace or something. I don't know what happened, but he gained weight. And even though he looked exactly the same, eventually he was, 5'3" and 160 pounds, I guess. But he's a little guy, and he's constantly underestimated. He's always going up against these big, hulking brutes. Brutish owl hoots. And he gains a reputation for himself. And in fact, in this very scene, he becomes an outlaw. But he doesn't become an outlaw by killing anyone, because he can't, because he's in this Marvel comic book. So he just wounds this guy and then runs off. In self-defense. He wounds a guy in self-defense. And if he had stood trial, he would have won easy, probably. He didn't even kill the guy. And they both had guns. But he runs off, because the whole point of these early issues is that he's on the run. Right? So he has to be an outlaw, even though he's not like an outlaw who ever killed anybody. And, you know, in the next issue, he's on the run with his peculiar looking horse. A lot of the artwork in this is actually pretty fantastic. And like I said, the Rawhide Kid has superpowers. And here we have a scene where he's shooting, and he's riding his horse while he's doing it. And he manages to disarm all of these people. All of these guys. Just shoots the guns right out of their hands from a moving horse. It's almost supernatural, his powers. And he's like that. He's also incredibly fast. He does all these weird acrobatics. And you might think, since he's a little guy, that, well, maybe these big, brutish villains that he's always coming across, these big gunfighters, they would just put their guns down and just kick the hell out of him because he's so little. Boy, is that a bad idea, because the Rawhide Kid, if you try to fight him, he'll just kick the crap out of you no matter how big you are. You could be like, 300 pounds, and you could be the Hulk, probably, and the Rawhide Kid would just kick the crap out of you because, that's what he does. And so it's fun. I have to say, this comic book is a lot better than I thought it was going to be. First of all, the art is really, really good. Jack Kirby art for most of this. There's the Rawhide Kid there. You see him to scale with the typical villain that he goes up against. But the artwork is really good. The action is crazy. I mean, this just has some of the wildest action. There's what I was talking about, the Rawhide Kid, man. He's just going to kick the hell out of you. But really great action. Very entertaining stories by Stan Lee. They all speak cowboyese. If they don't say sure, for example. They say shore. S-H-O-R-E. Shore. And they say everything cowboy. Like, they don't say you, they say ya. Y-W-H. You ain't through yet. You still got me to settle with, for example. They say reckon a whole lot. They speak cowboy. And it's tremendously entertaining. And these issues also have a lot of backup features or backup stories. So basically, this will have a Rawhide Kid story, these early issues. Then they'll have just some random Western story and that story could be illustrated by, anybody from the Marvel Comics stable at the time. And then they would have another Rawhide Kid story. And they also had text stories, which some comic magazines did. Like every issue would have a text story. You'd see this a lot in old horror comic books and stuff like that. For a while, comic books could not be considered magazines unless they had a text story in it for some reason. That rule didn't last, thank goodness, because kids, of course, just skipped these. I didn't skip them. I read them. And I don't know if Stan Lee wrote those or not, but they're actually pretty good, a lot of them. I was surprised how good those were. I mean, they weren't great, but they're better than you'd expect for a story that nobody's going to read if they're kids and they're just here to read about the Rawhide Kid. This comic was interesting because it had some weird stuff in it. There is a part, there's this story here where the Rawhide Kid fights the Terrible Totem, which is a giant monster. This was also the period when there were a lot of giant monster comics, which showed up before the Fantastic Four. There were a bunch of monster comics. by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And we have the Rawhide Kid who actually battles a monster. And I thought, that's interesting. That is not something that you would expect. But yeah, he fights a giant monster, a Jack Kirby monster. That was an interesting story. Jack Kirby does most of the stories in these early issues. Eventually, Jack Kirby leaves, and he was replaced. And I was really surprised going through this that initially Jack Kirby's replacement was Jack Davis. Jack Davis, who was an EC comic book artist, the early EC comics. He drew a bunch of horror comics and a bunch of the stories in Two-Fisted Tales. And so I was really surprised to see Jack Davis. I think this was some of Jack Davis's last art for like a regular color comic book. He went on, Jack Davis, to work on Mad Magazine, which was a good move for him. These stories by Jack Davis, I mean, some of them look like his work, and some of them were pretty good, but they tended not to be great. Not as good as the Jack Davis you would remember from his horror stories in EC Comics. I think he was kind of phoning this in. So even though it was good, it wasn't like the Jack Davis you would remember from EC Comics. And it certainly isn't as good as what Jack Kirby was doing on the book. I forget who takes over after Jack Davis left. I think these last issues were by Jack Davis. Yeah, Jack Davis finishes out this volume. Was it Larry Lieber? Maybe, but somebody else took over, and eventually Rawhide Kid continued to be published, but they just did reprints for a long time. And then Rawhide Kid's lowest moment hit when he was brought back in the early 2000s, and the Rawhide Kid was turned into a gay character. Turns out Rawhide Kid was gay. This is something that comic companies started doing in the 21st century. They would take existing characters who were never gay before, and they make them gay instead of creating new characters who were gay. They just make old characters gay who were never gay before. I mean, and that's fine for the Rawhide Kid, I guess. But the problem was that in making Rawhide Kid a gay character, they didn't just do that. They made him a gay stereotype. And like every line that anybody said in this comic book from the early 2000s was some kind of sexual innuendo. And it was not great. It is a comic book I think Marvel wishes they had not done. This is not the way to make a character who is gay, because it just kind of made him a joke. It made Rawhide Kid a joke, and it made the idea of a guy in the Old West who was gay, it made that a joke. So it wasn't great. It wasn't great in any way. The artwork was pretty good, if you can get past everything else, but why would you want to, really? So Marvel did not treat this character particularly well. I wouldn't mind seeing Rawhide Kid come back as himself, as he was back in these days, but that's never, ever, ever going to happen. I would be surprised if we ever even get like another reprint volume of this that isn't Marvel Masterworks. They'll never do, I don't think, an epic collection of Rawhide Kid. Westerns aren't popular enough. This character is just, I think, for a lot of people, a footnote in Marvel history. But these are entertaining comics. These are tremendous fun. Jack Kirby's artwork is great. And it was a fun comic book. It was an entertaining comic book. If there were a volume 2 that floating around out there, I'd probably buy it, even though Jack Kirby's artwork isn't in it, probably. I would buy it just because, Rawhide Kid is a lot of fun. And so I'm glad I finally read this character, and I've gone on and on about it. Do you have anything to say? Roger doesn't have anything to say about the Rawhide Kid. It's not his favorite. Not your favorite? Who was your favorite? He doesn't have a favorite. Who do you like?
Jonah Hex.
He doesn't like anybody. Anyway,
Jonah Hex.
I will catch you next time.